much for coming to this guest lecture hosted by Educational Foundations and Research. I am excited and honored to introduce Christine McCleave. She's going to be speaking about addressing and understanding the ongoing trauma created by U.S. Indian boarding schools. She is enrolled at Turtle Mountain Ojibwe and the Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. McCleave is a generational boarding school survivor. Her grandfather attended Martin Catholic Indian Boarding School and Haskell Indian Boarding School. Her great-grandfather attended Carlisle Industrial Indian School. Boarding schools' intergenerational impacts on our personal life and children's lives led McCleave to complete her Master's of Arts in Leadership, research on the spectrum of spiritual practices between traditional Native American spirituality and Christianity, and the legacy of boarding schools and spiritual activities today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Virginia, for inviting me, and thank you all for having me. So are we good on the audio?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just speak up. I think that one right there on the wall was if you're the best.
Oh, okay.
So here's out that way.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, so thank you all for being here today. Dinaway Maginiduk, that's greetings my relatives in Ojibwe. And, okay.
Get this out of your way. Sorry.
Yes, that's blocking the vacancy. Okay, great. Indisi Indigenicons, Makinakawaju and Dunjiba, Migizi and Dudang. My name is Christine Dindisi McCleave. Dindisi means Blue Jay in Ojibwe. And I am from Turtle Mountain Reservation, North Dakota. I'm Ojibwe. And I am Eagle Clan. So that was a traditional Ojibwe protocol greeting. And I started working for the Boarding School Healing Coalition, as you all heard in my bio, as a result of this personal journey and the impacts on my family and then my research. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our work at the coalition, but I want to see who is in the audience. So if you're a student here, I'm assuming you're all students, but if you're a student, raise your hand. Okay. All right. And if you have boarding school history in your family, raise your hand. Okay. All right. So the Boarding School Healing Coalition was formed as an official nonprofit in the year 2012. The Native American Rights Fund was our fiscal sponsor and helped get us started. But it was really the result of years of grassroots organizing. And in 2011, there was a national symposium that was hosted at Colorado University, and they invited people from all over the U.S., and in Canada, including some of the commissioners from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the consensus was that we needed a similar process here in the U.S., that boarding school impacts were still affecting our families and our lives, and that we wanted the government to acknowledge what their federal policy of assimilation and cultural genocide had done, and possibly have some kind of reparations or some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in the U.S. So that's how we got started, and we are a coalition of members, so it's free to become an individual member, and we also have organizations and tribes. So you can join as an Indigenous member or as a non-Native ally. And our vision is Indigenous cultural sovereignty and really restoring that Indigenous cultural sovereignty. And our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit today. I do have to give you a heads up that this is a very dense presentation. I give a lot, and you're gonna like drink from the fire hose. So it's a lot to take in, it's a lot to digest. If I had more time with you, I would build in some breaks and you would dialogue and we might get up and do some exercises, but we don't have time for that. And I have a lot of information to share and to impart. So we're gonna talk about the history of boarding schools and some of the personal stories that came out of those boarding school experiences, the impacts of intergenerational trauma, and what our communities are doing to heal trauma today. So a quick overview of the history is that from 1879 to the 1970s, the federal government ran 357 plus U.S. Indian boarding schools. These were government funded, and some of them were church run. Their goal was assimilation, and the result was genocide and cultural genocide. Indian children under this policy were forcibly abducted. They were sent hundreds of miles away. They were stripped of their clothes. Their hair was cut, and they were given a number rather than a name. These were military-style institutions, and children were often neglected, malnourished, beaten, starved, or otherwise abused. That is historical assimilative boarding schools. Now, I did bring a copy of our publication, and it's up here at the front table. And in the center fold, you will see a map, which is a list of all 357 boarding schools that one of our researchers compiled. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you'll see that there are still 54 boarding schools that are still open in the US. So there are still Indian boarding schools. They are no longer under that assimilative model, but they do have a history and a legacy. So how did this all get started? Well, it goes all the way back to the doctrine of discovery. And basically that was a papal bull that the Catholic Pope, Roman Catholic Church issued this decree saying that basically if Christian or Catholic people found land that was inhabited by non-Christian people, that they could claim it as their own. So that is what happened here in the US. And then the idea that came from that was this manifest destiny. And that picture, that painting there is called American Progress. That's by John Gast from 1872. And it's of the angel Columbia. And she is moving from east to west. She's holding a book, which is believed to symbolize education. She's stringing a telephone wire or electric wire. The railroad is coming, the stagecoach is coming off in the distance. We have a little port town, and in the forefront we have agriculture. And this is all American progress, right? Civilization, Western civilization. And to the west, they are displacing and removing the, so someone is on and they need to mute. Okay, they did. Great,
Sorry,
thank you.
I just look at chat in case there's any kind of problems.
All right. For dramatic effect, they are removing and displacing the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, of this continent, of this land. And you can see the buffalo and the native peoples in the forefront don't even look fully clothed. So, so it's definitely a painting that is from a certain perspective, and it symbolizes this idea of manifest destiny, that these people believed it was their God-given destiny and right to come and settle and colonize here in North America. So there were a couple different policies that led to Indian boarding schools, but we talk about boarding schools as one layer of historical trauma in Native communities, and that there are multiple layers of historical trauma, starting with contact. As soon as settlers and colonial settlers came, they brought new diseases that we did not have immunity to. And although there were some initial contact that was friendly, there was early on warring for territory. So we get into this invasion and removal where they're basically having Indian wars. And then the government starts to make treaties with tribes and says, okay, you know, we have our people coming, we want land, we want to live peaceably with you. We'll take this land, we'll set aside this land, we'll reserve this land over here for you and your people. And in exchange for all this land that you're giving us, that you're ceding to the US, we will give you education and health care, and we'll even give you rations because we're changing your ways of subsistence. You can't just hunt wherever you want anymore. So those are all the treaties that the government made with sovereign nations, nation-to-nation treaties. And of course, when they found gold in the Black Hills, they ignored the treaty that said those Black Hills belonged to the Lakota and Dakota people. As they found gold in California, they continued westward, and we had more and more Indian wars. Then we began the assimilation era, and that's where boarding schools came into play. That was also post-Civil War era when there was a large campaign to kill the buffalo. They said every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. And that was a direct attack on the economy of the Plains people. So that was the assimilation era. And then they continued with other federal policies that said tribes had to reorganize. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, they said you have to create a constitution like that of the US, or we won't recognize you as a sovereign nation, as a tribe. They started to terminate tribes. They relocated people. And I forgot the Trail of Tears is in this history too. So a lot of trauma happening to Indigenous peoples. And now we are in the self-determination era. And we have a lot of legislation that started after the Civil Rights era and the American Indian movement. And however, we're still fighting for our rights. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 that was meant to protect our children from being removed, that is currently under attack. So although we are in the self-determination era, we are still fighting for our Indigenous rights. So how did the boarding school policy get put into place? It wasn't actually one policy. It was a series of legislation and policies. Starting with 1819, the Indian Civilization Fund Act created a fund to civilize Indians, just how it says. And their idea was that they wanted to assimilate the native peoples, and they wanted them to become farmers and laborers. And so they created this, this fund within the government aimed at that. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was ultimately created to administer the fund. And it was created under the Department of War, because that was the department, that was the arm of the government that was dealing with the Indian problem, quote unquote, Indian problem. And then in 1868, Grant's peace policy came into effect, and they put an end to treating Indians. So the peace policy was that, we're not going to keep warring with the Indians. We're just going to be at peace, and we're not going to make any more of these treaties. We're going to focus on assimilating them. And basically, they, within the Grant's peace policy, they allowed for the monies from the Indian Civilization Fund to be used by Christian missionaries, because they had some of their Indian agents under the Department of War and the Bureau of Indian Affairs were corrupt and withholding rations. The Dakota Wars are about that very thing. And so that is how we get to a place where federal money is going for church-run schools, going to church-run schools. So the churches were kind of vying for territory. This, Native Americans were a way for them to get funding from the government, and so eventually they had to divide up the reservations amongst the different denominations. And so this is a list of some of the different denominations and how many Indians they were kind of allotted under this division of reservations. And Captain Richard Pratt is often given a lot of credit for coming up with the idea for boarding schools, these military-run boarding schools. But he had a friend, Sheldon Jackson, that I don't have a slide for because I'm still learning more about Sheldon Jackson. But basically, Pratt opened the first off-reservation federal boarding school, which was Carlisle Boarding School in Pennsylvania. And Sheldon Jackson opened the second one, which was Chemawa, and that's in Oregon. And Chemawa is still open to this day. So Pratt was a military man who had some prisoners of war, and he saw that he was able to teach them English and that he was able to get them to act like soldiers. And so he petitioned for this school to be opened because they were, quote, capable of being civilized. And so he got Carlisle Indian Industrial School to be opened. And his thing, he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. He really believed as a Christian person that he was doing a compassionate thing, because at the time there were still Indian wars going on. And he said, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. And that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So he's the one who coined that term. As I mentioned, children were forcibly taken. It was written into the peace policy that if parents resisted letting their kids go to boarding school or being taken by the state, that the agents could withhold rations or they could incarcerate the parents. So this is a photo of 19 Hopi men designated as hostiles that were taken into custody in 1894 and incarcerated at Alcatraz. Their crime was that they opposed the forced removal and education of their children in government boarding schools. The rest of that quote says, held in confinement and hard labor until they fully realize the error of their evil ways, until they shall evince in an unmistakable manner a desire to cease interference with the plans of the government for the civilization and education of its Indian wards. Oh, I heard something really interesting recently about, in the original treaties, they used language like brother to brother, nation to nation, brother to brother, we were equals. But then sometime afterwards, it became the great white father in the nation's capital. And so there began this kind of patrimony that, that we were less than, and we were wards and not able to care for ourselves. Even though we'd only survived here for millennia before colonization. So when children were, when they arrived at boarding school, the civilizing process began. They were, all their clothes were removed, so any of their traditional clothing. And in some cases, parents sent their children in their best clothes and with ceremonial items to keep them safe. And all that was taken from them as soon as they arrived. Their hair was cut, and different tribes have different beliefs about cutting their hair, but for many it was a traumatic experience because it was associated with grieving and loss. They were often deloused because of lice, and they were bathed in harsh chemicals. We have record that in some cases it was DDT. And some children had acid burns on their skin, and some of them were blinded. This is a famous picture of Tom Torlino, who's Navajo, before and after attending Carlisle. And the reason there are so many before and after pictures of Carlisle students is because Pratt hired a photographer, and he was intentionally creating this propaganda to show that his experiment worked. And you can see that Tom not only looks, he looks, his clothes are changed, his hair is shorter, but he actually looks lighter skinned. So the photographer, did this intentionally, increase the flash so that he looks even whiter. The other interesting thing about Tom is that he is not a child. He went to Carlisle as a prisoner of war. So not all the students at Carlisle were children. Some of them were actually prisoners of war. We have record of children that came from Alaska, even though Alaska was a state at the time. They were orphans, and they were sent to Carlisle. There's even record of some indigenous people from Puerto Rico being sent to Carlisle. There's also records at Carlisle that say they rejected some students because they looked too dark and appeared African. So they were really intentional about who they let into Carlisle, and they wanted to take these before and after photos. We actually had Tom's great-great-granddaughter come to our conference, our first conference that we had last year in Carlisle, and she gave a talk about how her family feels about this image of their ancestor and their relative being used to kind of represent Indian boarding schools. They have mixed feelings. And so it's always important to remember when we look at these historical photos that these are people's relatives. These are real people. And in Tom's case, he went back to his Navajo community. He was a farmer for some years, as Carlisle had trained him to be. But then late in his life, he did become a medicine man and return to his traditional ways. So as I mentioned, these schools had a very heavily militarized setup, and this is a photo at Chamawa, so it's a reservation Indian boarding school. And these are some quotes from students who went there. They gave me a number. I was 76. All my clothes, underwear, socks, dresses had number 76. When my laundry came back folded, it has a slip of paper on top of it with the number 76 on it. Wearing school clothing and marching uniforms was mandatory to impose conformity and military discipline on students. Upon their arrival, traditional clothing seen as a shell of savagery was literally cast off. So we also have stories of people being punished in kind of like military corporal punishment ways. Like if they misbehaved, they were forced to kneel on a broomstick or kneel in the corner with their nose touching the wall, or scrub floors with toothbrushes, things like that. Their ceremony was changed. As I mentioned, they would take these things that represented their culture. Language was prohibited. Children were often beaten for speaking their language. They weren't allowed to pray in their traditional ways. And this is a photo of a Cheyenne woman who, on the left, is in her traditional ceremonial dress as a Cheyenne person, and then on the right is in Western ceremonial dress as a bride for a wedding. In a lot of cases, these schools use the children for labor. And at Carlisle, they had a summer program where instead of sending the children home for the summer, they farmed them out as labor to local communities. So my great-grandfather, who went to Carlisle, spent his summers working at a local farm, and he was paid a wage that was, the farmers actually paid the school, and then the school deposited a portion of that into my grandfather's account. And I actually looked at his record, and there's letters going back and forth between his father and the school because there's a dispute about my great-grandfather's earnings. So the school was not always giving the children and the students as much money as they should have. And in fact, when Carlisle came to a close, there was a scandal and there was a lot of scrutiny over the finances and the way the school had been doing things. A lot of those students, so Carlisle has a cemetery, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but like a lot of these students, sometimes they would die in the community, so they're not buried at the school, they're buried in these surrounding towns. Sometimes they would meet somebody of the opposite sex and they would run away, or they would, once they graduated school, they would move to that community and stay there. So these outings had a great impact on the students. There's also record of student labor at the school. So Carlisle had a farm where the students grew the food that they were eating. They, in some cases at different schools, they sewed the uniforms, and they even built the caskets that the students would be buried in if they died due to disease or violence or accidents. So in 1928, the Miriam report, titled "The Problem of Indian Administration," called out boarding schools and said that there was a disquieting illustration of failure to understand the underlying principles of human behavior. Punishments of the most harmful sort are bestowed in sheer ignorance. The report cited malnourishment, poor living conditions, hard labor, and long days, corporal punishment, lack of family life, leading to poor mental health, and no follow-up. And really, just not very much education. So my great-grandfather, when he went to Carlisle, he was an adult, but when he left Carlisle after 5 years, he had a third-grade education. In 1969, because not all the boarding schools closed after the Merriam Report, the Kennedy Report, called Federal Boarding Schools and the Indian Child, declared Indian education to be a national tragedy and the care of Indian children in boarding schools to be grossly inadequate. What we know now is that this policy was genocide. And up in Canada at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they called it cultural genocide because Canada had residential schools that they modeled after the US. And we've had debates on our board of directors and with our membership in the coalition. And we could call it cultural genocide really as a placation. But the truth is, it meets the definition of genocide according to the UN Geneva Convention. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is genocide. All these other things too, outside of boarding school, have also happened in the US. So it's very clear that here in the US, we have genocide that we have not reconciled ourselves with. And these are a couple of books that call it that: the American Holocaust and American Genocide. Yet we have never had any kind of acknowledgement from our government that this is what they did. Article 8 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is just 11 years old, and the US did not sign on to right away, it says that Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. I'll talk about that later. Okay, so there's also an article in that publication that talks about how Indian boarding schools were the first Indian child welfare policy of the US. When you think about it, right? This was their first policy about Indian children, was to take them, move them far away from their community, and put them in these boarding schools to assimilate them. So it's no wonder that the current problem we have with child removal is systematic. It was designed to remove the Indigenous child. In 1958, as some boarding schools were closing, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project, in which they were still aiming at taking children out of Indian homes and placing them with white people. And so instead of placing them in a school, they said, let's just place them directly with white folks. And so you would see things like this, an ad in the newspaper for Indian children. And in that publication, there's a newspaper clipping. It says that the children come in all hues and colors. So again, speaking about us as objects. By the 60s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their communities, and during this era, social workers found more and more dubious ways of taking children from their mothers. In some cases, they were signing a quote-unquote release form. They thought to get out of the hospital to be released, but they were actually releasing custody of their children. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978, but despite ICWA, Native children are still placed at higher rates per capita than any other ethnic group. And these placements still often lead to adoption with non-Native families. One of our board members, Sandy Whitehawk, is a former adoptee, and she works with Native people who are adoptees and want to return to their community and find out who they are and where they come from. And it's a very similar process from healing from the impacts of boarding school. It's the impacts are the same. It's disconnection from culture, loss of identity, loss of family connection, community connection, and the path to healing is also very similar to reconnect with those things. And what's interesting is that she has pointed out to me that the adoption business is just that. It's a business. There's money in brown children, and there's money in foster care. And so there's a lot of scrutiny about the way social workers deal with Indian children, and there should be. And like I said, ICWA is under attack. It was deemed unconstitutional by a federal court in Texas because it's a race-based law, which, I mean, I'm not an attorney and I don't want to get into a whole legal discussion, but it really speaks to the ignorance of why the Indian Child Welfare Act was created in the first place. Why would we need an act about Indian children in the first place if they weren't being targeted, if this wasn't a federal policy in the first place? So this is a copy of a letter from 1952. It shows that there was really no accountability with what they did with these children. So this one says the guy at Tekakwitha Indian Mission School writes a letter to somebody who has sent him $10 and asked for a child. And he says he has a few little boys or girls who have no one at all interested in whether they live or die or come or go. I will send you a little boy of 6 years old or older, or a little girl, whatever you prefer. These Indian children are very little trouble, especially the one I have in mind. If you really mean it, I will see that we will get him ready. You may have him at any time you desire. I'm not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did. So we know today that this would be defined as human trafficking. And there is a high instance of sexual abuse in boarding schools and in foster care. And it's because of very little accountability. In that case, very little screening. And I believe they still do not properly screen before placing children. So in 2014, under the previous administration, the White House report on Native youth declares a state of emergency around Native youth suicide. There's an epidemic. Finds, of course, major disparities in health, education, as well as high rates of suicide, and post-traumatic stress disorder rates 3 times that of the general public, the same as Iraqi war veterans. Why is that? Well, that's historical trauma. That's intergenerational trauma. That's complex trauma. So the DSM doesn't really have a diagnosis for historical trauma, but really, as I've just described to you, Native Americans have layers of trauma, right? So it's the closest diagnosis would be complex trauma. So if you want to read some more about personal stories, these are some books that have people's stories in them. Interestingly, that first one, I've often debated whether or not to take it out because of the controversy that was surrounding Sherman Alexie after allegations of sexual harassment. But I leave it up there for a purpose because prior to that, he was a hero of Native American literature, having written so many books that were kind of mainstream and accepted by mainstream society. And this memoir that he wrote about his mother, he titled it, "You Don't Have to Say You Love Me." And we hear a lot of boarding school survivors talk about, and descendants talk about how their parents did not express affection a lot. And that's because they were raised by institutions. And so they had a lack of parenting skills. And he has a chapter in this book where he tells the boarding school story, and it's very powerful. And of course, then there's Pipestone, My Life at an Indian Boarding School by Adam Fortunate Eagle, the story of Chilocco Indian School, they called it Fairy Light by Sanina Lomawema, and Tim Giaggio's Children Left Behind, the Dark Legacy of Indian Mission Boarding Schools. So my family, on the left-hand side, that's my great-grandfather who went to Carlisle. That's our family photo album picture. I didn't know he went to Carlisle Indian Boarding School until I had been in this job for 6 months. Why? Because nobody in my family talked about it. And it was when I was asking about my grandfather on the right, about his boarding school experience, that my uncle sent me this other picture. So my great-grandfather was actually recruited by Pop Warner to play for the football team at Carlisle. He did play with Jim Thorpe. And I thought, why wasn't this is something to be proud of? Why wouldn't they tell us? But like I said, when I saw my great-grandfather's school records, there were some negative things that happened to him there. And when my grandfather went to a Catholic boarding school, he came back and never wanted to step foot in the Catholic Church again. And he passed before I could ask him about boarding schools. But when I asked my family members, my mom and my uncle and my aunt, they said he never wanted to talk about it. And he would say that, I don't want to talk about it. And so this is to illustrate the fact that we need to ask about these stories in our families. And although they may be difficult to share with our elder relatives, need to tell us what happened so we can understand and we can heal from that. These are photos that were in somebody else's PowerPoint of my great-grandfather. And I saw them going through on a slideshow while they were, doing like this benefit. And I went up afterwards and said, I think I saw my great-grandfather in your slideshow. And we went back and found them, and they had gotten them from an archive. And it's just, again, to illustrate, these are people's relatives. They may be in the public domain because they're more than 75 years old, but these are people's family members. So my research, my thesis was called Spiritual Leadership in Modern Day Native American Culture and Approaches to Native American Religion and Christianity. So like I said, my grandfather went to that Catholic boarding school. The Catholic Church is predominant on the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and so I was raised Catholic. But then when I got into high school, I started learning about U.S. history and the role of the church in boarding schools and forced conversions. And I became really resentful at organized religion. And then later in life, was seeking spiritual guidance and started to realize that many different religions had spiritual scripts that were really great, and that people had often been the ones to fall short of the Creator's ideals for us. And so I wanted to kind of resolve these issues that I had with religion. And so I did a study in the Twin Cities that looked at spiritual practices and approaches to Native American religion and Christianity, looking at areas of compatibility, areas of conflict, and also what any of those spiritual communities were doing around Indian activism. Because as I did the lit review, and not only covered the history of boarding schools, I found that our earliest Indian activists were the ones who were converted early on and learned English and became educated and started to advocate for their communities within the church. Those were our early Indian activists. They were in the church. So my findings were the biggest area of conflict seemed to revolve around the role of spirits, angels, demons, and ancestors in spiritual practices, that those two sets of beliefs could not easily be reconciled. And those who practiced blended Christianity with traditional Native spirituality were much more tolerant of other people's spirituality and religious practices. And those churches had cultural activities and language classes hosted in their buildings. So there were definitely people on the different ends of the spectrum, is what I found. One end of the spectrum was practicing Native spirituality to the exclusion of anything that had anything to do with Christianity, and it was often like some hurt and resentment there about that history. On the other end were evangelical Christians who would basically say that anything that had to do with traditional Native spirituality was evil, demonic, satanic, not biblical, etc. There were a lot of people kind of in the middle. There were, I found a couple of congregations and communities, spiritual communities, that were practicing blended theology. And I share this because it was not only my personal journey, but I know it's super important for Native people to understand that there's going to be people at different places in their journey, that there are Native people who practice different religions and spiritualities. I think it's important for non-Native people to understand that too. But particularly for us as Native people, to not try to impose our beliefs on others, because that's exactly what they did to us, right? So I have a lot of people, friends and colleagues who say, you know, in order to heal, you have to return to your traditional ways. And I said, well, you can't tell people about their own spirituality. You can't force them, because that's what they did to us. So really, we're at this place where, you know, I believe that in order to support people in their healing, if they have any spiritual beliefs, that's a good thing. That faith can provide healing and hope for them. Also, my recommendations, that was my conclusions. My recommendations are that churches be aware of this history and that they do not perpetuate the harms of forced conversion and shaming of Native spirituality and judging Native spirituality. I found this really interesting quote that said, for Native peoples to follow Jesus, they can best do so not by becoming Christian, but by following their traditional ways. Any religion that is based on exclusivist notions of salvation necessarily becomes a religion tied to conquest and empire. Yeah. So, let's see, I know I'm running a little behind, but I told you there was a lot. Okay, so intergenerational trauma. So Dr. Maria Yellowhurst-Braveheart coined the term historical trauma. We were fortunate enough to have her come be the keynote at our conference last year. And she defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. Now, she said she kind of regrets calling it historical trauma because it's like a misnomer. People think it's just about history in the past, but it says right there in that definition, over one's lifetime. So that means anything that happened to me prior to today is historical trauma. Anything that happened to me as a child, or you know, up to yesterday, even today, actually. Anything that happened in my lifetime can be historical trauma. And we found a study in 2004 that surveyed Native Americans who had children and asked them about historical trauma. 36% had daily thoughts about the loss of traditional language in their community. 34% experienced daily thoughts about loss of culture. 24 reported feeling angry regarding historical losses. 49% provided they had disturbing thoughts related to these losses. 46 had daily thoughts about alcohol dependency and its impact on their community. 22% indicated they felt discomfort with white people. 35% were distrustful of the intentions of the dominant white culture due to these historical losses. So that speaks volumes to how this really isn't something that, you know, a lot of people sometimes, the deniers will be like, just get over it, why can't you move on? Because we see the impacts in our lives, in our families, in our communities. It's not something that will just go away. So regarding abuse, we know that there was abuse in these schools. That's a picture of child-sized handcuffs that was from Haskell. And the gauntlet is a form of punishment that we've heard about at several boarding schools, where the students had to line up. We've heard of it two different ways: 2 rows of students, and the one runs down the middle and they beat them with a belt, or they all line up back to back and straddle, and the kid has to crawl through the bottom, and they beat him while he's crawling through. If you didn't deliver a full force blow while the student ran through, then you would go next. We know that from one of our interviews that was done on boarding school survivors that a boy died from the gauntlet beating, and then that student had to build his coffin and wondered till he was an old man when he was interviewed if it was his blow that killed the boy. So these are some quotes about sexual abuse that took place in the school. In South Dakota, they changed the statute of limitations to be 3 years after you turn 18. you have to report abuse, otherwise you can't take it to court. And there's 9 sisters who all were sexually abused in a Catholic boarding school in South Dakota. They're trying to get that legislation changed. And I'm writing this much right now for myself and for anyone else in this room who might need it, because this type of content is really hard. It's traumatic content. So I'm not going to read these to you guys. You can read them. I went to the Truth and Reconciliation Center at the University of Manitoba last week, and I met with them there, and they were talking about how it was one thing during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk about the abuse that priests, nuns, or school staff had inflicted on the children, but it was a completely different thing to talk about the sexual abuse that the children were doing to each other. And that was something that reverberated through those communities to this day, because those abusers are still part of the community. So that's something they're having a really hard time healing and getting past. So prayer time was changed, and this is a historical photo of boys being prayed with at bedtime by the priest. This documentary is on YouTube. Our Spirits Don't Speak English, and there's a clip that I used to show, but I don't anymore because it's traumatic to watch. As an elder, and he breaks down and he cries, and he says that when he went to boarding school, he didn't speak English, and when he learned to pray in English, he felt like the spirits and the ancestors were saying, "What are you saying? We can't understand you. We don't speak English." And so I would just caution you, that those types of videos and testimonials, that you can experience secondhand trauma, or what's called vicarious trauma, watching that. We do know there's research now that says that trauma can be passed down on top of your DNA. Epigenetics was a study done by Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, and she originally did this study on survivors of the Holocaust and found that their children were more likely to develop stress or anxiety disorders. She later repeated her study because they actually thought it was a mistake. The genetic marker was lower levels of cortisol, which cortisol is a stress hormone, and you would think that their levels would be higher. So they thought it might have been a mistake, and they repeated the study with Iraqi war veterans and also with mothers who were pregnant and present at the 9/11 attacks. And they were able to repeat the results. The offspring and descendants had lower levels of cortisol. And basically, it's because when your baseline level of cortisol for a normal person, I need to do a slide for this, would be here, in the middle, and here's the lower ones, and here's where it spikes when you experience stress. The cortisol spikes and comes down, and so basically, if baseline normal is here, and these people who are predisposed to stress and anxiety have lower baselines, they have a bigger bandwidth for which to react to stress. So you could say it might be a genetic evolution that is meant to be an advantage for people who have been in traumatic or stressful situations. So depending on how you look at it, it may not be a bad thing. It could just be resiliency. The good news is those genetic markers have been found to be reversed through behavioral therapy. And we also know from the ACEs study, that's adverse childhood experiences, that when a child has these adverse or traumatic experiences, that it affects their brain development. And this diagram is, a little complicated, and I'm kind of running short on time, so I'm going to skip over that. Basically, we know this impacts the development of their young growing brains, and then they grow up to have all the impacts of having ACEs as a child, and then they have children, they're more likely to produce children who experience ACEs. And so it's a cycle. So, healing. If we carry intergenerational trauma, and we know that we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and in our DNA, and I would also add that it's in our blood memories, it's in our ancestors. So Dr. Braveheart talks about transcending historical trauma as having 4 steps. 1 is to confront the historical trauma. 2 is to understand it. 3 is to release the pain, and 4 is to transcend the trauma. So really, the Boarding School Healing Coalition is focusing heavily on number 1 and 2 to support 3 and 4 for people, right? We are really trying to understand, confront and understand this historical trauma. And we support language and culture. And instead of let all that is Indian in you die, we say let all that is Indian within you live. We know that loss of language and culture is a direct legacy of the boarding school era, and so language and cultural revitalization is direct healing from the boarding school era. We support balanced self-care. This is a medicine wheel that we developed and included with our conference program. And also we developed a list of care resources that are included in a survey that I'll talk about. People are experiencing triggers, if they're being traumatized, that these are things they can do to care for themselves. We have developed Healing Voices Story Collection, where we highlight boarding school stories, but we focus on the healing journey to show that there is hope for resiliency and healing. So we didn't want to create more videos like the one I mentioned, and there are a lot more out there that I've seen where it makes an impact, and it might get somebody to send you a donation, but it's actually doing more harm than good to show these videos of somebody reliving their trauma. So we wanted this Healing Voices story collection to be different, and so they're curated videos. It's not just straight testimony, and we also engage the youth. We teach them, we give them media training, and we have them be involved with their elders to kind of bridge that generational gap and help them understand the impacts of boarding school on their families and their communities. So Patsy Whitefoot was one of our first interviewees. She was on our board. She was also the president of the board for NIA, the National Indian Education Association. And as a leader in her community and as a national leader, it was a big deal for her to tell her boarding school story and to talk about her journey to healing. That was really difficult for her. She talked about how it was hard for her to forgive people who had already passed on. And that was hard work for her to do, but she was able to do that. And then she said, we need to continue to hold up our children, our babies, because that's who we are in the future beyond our life here. So, back to Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart's process of healing historical trauma, confronting it, the truth needs to be told. We believe in truth in history. There's all kinds of conversations we can have about that. Virginia and I were having some in the car on the way here about, I'm in Minneapolis, and there's all kinds of stuff going on with the signs at Fort Snelling, saying that Fort Snelling at Bedote, which is the Dakota word of the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi River there, the renaming of Lake Calhoun to Bede-Makaska, and I even saw an article about people in California, indigenous people in California fighting to have their history included. So, and everything I just told you here today, right? Native American history is American history. So as a country, we can't deny the true history of how this country was built, what took place to make it what it is today. So the truth has to be told, and we need to raise that awareness. We need people to acknowledge what happened and to become aware of the effects and legacies, so that healing can take place and then can live at peace and there can be reconciliation. But I have a lot of church groups that contact us and they're all excited about, reconciliation with Native peoples. And I say, well, that's great, but we need to focus on truth and healing first. Can you look into the church-run boarding schools? Can you help us find the records? Let's do some reconciliation, like we Native peoples have a lot of healing to do. We can't come to the table for reconciliation until there's been some healing. And the healing can take place through that process of uncovering the truth. So we have broken our research into those categories. We have a database on our website, so if you go, you can search by these categories. You can also search by different search ways. But basically, the history is where we're focusing. We're trying to find the records. So our website is boardingschoolhealing.org. You can see it says there's a research database up there in the corner. So in Canada, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was started by a class action lawsuit, and the government settled with all these people who had been abused at boarding schools. And it was, like a record-breaking historical government settlement up in Canada. The claimants used part of the money to create, they agreed to use the money to create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As part of that settlement, the courts ordered all the boarding school records to be brought forward for the commission to be analyzed. So as a result, after the 5-year commission ended in 2016, they have a 7-volume report. They have 94 calls to action. They know the number of boarding schools they had in their country, the number of children who went to those boarding schools. They know how many children died in those boarding schools, how many children went missing. They have a lot of information, a lot of data to analyze. And here in the US, we get asked these questions all the time, and we don't know. We have asked, our organization has asked the government for these records. We did a Freedom of Information Act request. They closed our request and didn't tell us, and a reporter was following up with me, and she said, I contacted them and they said it was closed, and she said they said they don't do research. That was their response. So all we know is we have some estimates about how many children were in boarding school, and by 1926, 83% of our children were being taken to boarding school. It took one of our founding board members, Dr. Denise Lashmadeer, 6 years to compile this list, and we have this little note at the bottom that says this list may not be complete because we're still finding boarding schools. So we say 357 plus. 64 remain open today. We know from some of the records, and we have researchers who looked into death rates. Preston McBride is a PhD candidate at UCLA, and he's doing his dissertation on death rates at Carlisle, Chemawa, Sherman, and Haskell. And he found that the majority of children who died from preventable diseases like tuberculosis, but that there are cases of children who go missing on the record, who die of violence, or who die of accidental death. Research that was completed by Dr. Patty Lowe showed that children were living in close quarters, so the disease was easy to spread, that health examinations were as short as 20 seconds per child. She also found record of children who died of abuse. We know some children died of what is called, quote unquote, failure to thrive. Basically, if they were a particularly young child, they would become depressed and they would stop eating, and then they would pass. So the death rate at Carlisle in 1890 was 49 children per 1,000, whereas the US death rate of the same year was 14 per 1,000. There were 293 deaths reported, but there were over 1,100 who were sent home because they were too sick to remain. And so they died either on the way home or shortly after getting home. And I heard one person say one time that that was intentional, that they were trying to spread this disease to the communities. I had never thought of that before. I always thought it was because they didn't want as many deaths on the record at the school, and that they had to start building cemeteries. So, you know, as we know, land was a big deal. So they just didn't want the deaths on the record or to have to be responsible for burying the children, because they did. And there's letters of record that showed parents requesting their children's remains to be sent home, and the school saying, we don't have the money. It's basically saying, no, you can't have your children's body back. So this is the photo of the cemetery at Chemawa, which contains headstones for over 220 students who died at the school. We have a researcher, Marcia Small, who has done ground penetrating radar there and found evidence of mass graves, unmarked graves. This is a photo from the cemetery at Carlisle. This was last year at our conference, and that's an elder from Alaska doing some prayer there at the cemetery. In Carlisle, they have started to repatriate some of the children. It's a unique situation because Carlisle is still an Army campus. It's the Army War College. And so these graves are on federal land. So basically the tribes started petitioning to get their children sent home, and the Army Corps of Engineers is paying for it. Tribes have contacted us and asked about repatriation from other cemeteries, and it's a case-by-case basis. In some cases, the cemeteries have been turned over to the city or the county, or they've been abandoned, and you know, it all depends on whose jurisdiction the land falls under. We held a tribal roundtable in 2017 after the first repatriation happened, because they went for 3 children and they only found 2. The third grave that was exhumed had 2 sets of remains, neither of which matched the age or sex of the child we were looking for. So prior to that, there were 12 graves marked unknown at the Carlisle Cemetery, and afterwards there were 14 graves marked unknown. We believe this is because they moved the cemetery at Carlisle in 1927 to build a parking lot. So as I mentioned, they were Alaskan children who were orphans who were sent to Carlisle. The Alaskan natives are really having a hard time getting these children back because of the process that the Army War College has gone through is not NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, but they're just having family members fill out an affidavit saying, yes, this is my relative, and then they'll repatriate. Well, they're not calling it repatriation, of course, because they're avoiding NAGPRA. So they're saying, we will disinter and or we will exhume and transport and reinter. So the children who were orphans, they're having a hard time locating relatives to fill out those affidavits. And so they're probably going to take a legal case to say, you know, these children are wards of the state, so we believe the tribe should be able to request their remains. So this is a blueprint of the cemetery, and this is taken from Dickinson College, created a digital archive of the Carlisle records. Now, these records were largely held at the federal NARA records. I believe they were in Washington, D.C. NARA has, you know, several locations around the country with federal records. So we think it's a problem that they went to digitize these. They probably had good intentions. You know, a lot of times people would have to travel to the archives if they wanted to research their relatives' records. But they applied for grant monies, and they created this digital collection, and they didn't consult with tribal nations, tribal people. And in fact, when I first made contact with them and told them my great-grandfather had went there, they said, oh, send us any pictures you have. We'll add them to the collection. I'm like, no, that's not okay. I'm not sending you my family's history so that you can make money off of it. So there's some issues we have with the digital archives that are being done. So we are actually going to do a digital archive, and we place tribal consultation at the head of our process. We are in the process of creating a digitalization policy and a digitization plan. And the grants that we've applied for so far, the process is, we identify the records that we want to digitize, and then we see whose tribal people are involved in those records, and then we start talking with those tribes. We let them view the records first to see if they want to remove or make private any culturally sensitive information or otherwise sensitive information about their people before we make the collection public. And we believe that that is the way these records should be treated. But there are other digitization projects going on. One at University of Nebraska, they're doing the Genoa Indian School, and then Sherman Indian School is digitizing their boarding school records as well. Next week, I'm heading to Geneva. I'm gonna rest between now and then. We submitted a filing to the United Nations Working Group on Enforcing Voluntary Disappearances about the children who went missing at boarding school. As human rights violation, we were hoping that the UN can launch an investigation and demand answers about these missing children from the US. Sometimes I feel like it's in futility because we've seen how our government responds to the UN, but we have to anyway. We have to. So we also have information up here. I have postcards, and we can follow up with you via email about a survey that we're doing in collaboration with the University of Minnesota and that board member that I mentioned who works with returning adoptees. And this survey is on child removal, and really it's the first survey of its kind to look at the connection between boarding schools and adoption and foster care. But the survey also really looks at the impacts of child removal on people's lives. So there's different sections in the survey that, depending on what section you qualify to answer, if you are a boarding school survivor, that's one section. If you are a boarding school descendant, that would be a different section that you might qualify for both of them. Or if you were placed in adoption or foster care. It's very rare that somebody would have all three sections, but you might qualify for two sections. And then the last couple sections of the survey are for everybody, and it's mental health, behavioral health, emotional health, questions about parenting, and then questions about healing. Like, what are how's your healing journey going? So we're super excited. The survey is going to stay open until March next year. We are going to publish a report with the results and try to get that very widespread. So if you're interested in seeing any of those results or taking the survey or passing that along to Native people that you know qualify to take the survey, please do so. Again, you can just go to our website, boardingschoolhealing.org, and right now we have a pop-up. No matter what page you land on, it'll pop up and say, take the survey. You can also sign up for our e-news to stay connected, and we'll send updates when we start analyzing the data. We've worked with the National Indian Education Association to develop a professional development curriculum on basically like trauma-informed schools, and this is in preparation for the next curriculum, which is for high school students. So we wanted to make sure that the school was ready to deal with some of the things that might come up when students go through the curriculum. So if, as I know, a lot of you students are teachers or in education programs at schools, if you're interested in having us come out and do that, please let me know. So this goes a little bit back to the records in the archive, the National Federal Archive locations. They only have 61 of the 357 7 schools. So this graphic's a little outdated. It's a 351 boarding school. So basically 80% of the records are not in the federal archives. We believe that they are in church archives or other state, county historical archives. We don't know. And that's a big problem. So that's something we're trying to deal with and working with some church groups on trying to get those church records. This is a screenshot of our database. Like I said, there's different ways you can search. You can search by area of interest, category, document type. There's over 300 resources in there, so check it out, including locations of those NARA archives and finding aids for what records they have. And we believe that assembling all these previously scattered sources into one central archive will help with, that understanding of what truly happened with this boarding school era, what the impacts have been. It'll help with research. And we also have found a platform that will allow us to link to the existing archives, the Dickinson Archive, the Genoa Archive. We've been in contact with the other archives, and they're willing to partner. It's it's a win-win. We get to link to the existing archives, and they get to be more searchable. So that's our big thing right now is this digital archive. We believe ultimately that restoring cultural sovereignty means that we have the right to set the terms of our healing and reconciliation, and I would add data sovereignty to that, because it means we have the right to say how data about us as Indigenous peoples is collected, how research is done, and then what gets done with that information and that data. So we uphold data sovereignty. And we're on social media, so follow us, help us get the word out, and I saved 10 minutes for questions.
I'm looking at doing some future research into the intergenerational effects of trauma, some quantitative research, and working with faculty who are can help me culturally with that. I'm wondering if you know of any data sets out there that are in connect generations in that way, or would this data set be surveyed? You're doing potentially with that?
They definitely
Yeah.
yeah. I didn't personally do the lit review for our survey, and I'm trying to remember when I read it, which means I skimmed it. I don't think there is much out there in terms of actually connecting the generations, other than like what I've already shared about epigenetics and a little bit on ACEs. The second slide I showed about ACEs and then the cycle. So if you want to email me, I can see if I can get you some references.
One of the other NARA centers, maybe Kansas City, presented on native schools, and she had done a lot of research there. So, and I did see that on your list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kansas City is, we do know of the records there. I'm not sure if it's why it's not on that list. It should be. Yeah, Kansas City is right there in the middle. Yep.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Kansas City.
All right. There's somebody chatting us a question, so let me grab the mouse.
Yeah. You got it.
Oh, okay, repeat the questions. Okay, so the first question was somebody asking for, for their research. I'm talking for the people who are, there's people listening in on Zoom virtually. So for our virtual listeners, the first question was about research that connects trauma between generations. So I believe you heard my answer there. And then our second question was about the National Archives record location in Kansas. We do have that on the list. And of course, like I said, you know, the NARA locations are the low-hanging fruit. Those are pretty easy. It's like, okay, government has these records. Where are the rest of them? That's the big question. And even the records that they have, they actually haven't made all of them public because of privacy laws. You can't make anything that's more than 75 years old public. So some of the schools, we can't even see the records because they are not divided by year. They're all interspersed. So for us to pull some of those records, you might end up seeing data that's about, you know, current modern day people who are still living, and that violates privacy laws. So they still have those records in private collections, not available to the public. So, you know, it's on my mind that we might need legislation or something to get access to these records.
In the past, they called people forward, just these citizen scientists, and they helped translate the latest census that we can see into something that can be searched. How do they handle Indian schools? I mean, they're not on Indian property. Would they be in the census? I guess we can see what before you that.
Oh, that's a really good question. And so for our online listeners, the question was about citizen scientists and looking at census information, and would boarding schools have been part of the census? And that's a good question. I don't know. We'll have to look at that.
Because 1940s are not what we do.
Yeah. I do know that sometimes researchers have looked at other records besides the BIA records and the federal records. So, for example, some research was done down at the Albuquerque Indian School, and on the record it said that 2 children had died, but when they looked at the county death records, there were over 200 children that had died. So, definitely looking at multiple sources.
More, sorry. One of the things that researchers might sort of ask as well as the people who were running the schools, who were thinking they were doing God's work. And frankly, the shame that goes on, because I think I was pretty close to people who were working on the Indian reservations and getting to South God. So, I mean, that's another kind of horrific side to look at as well, and I'm not sure.
Well, we need to know who those people were.
Yeah.
Okay, so for online listeners, she's talking about researching the people who ran the schools and who were doing the proselytizing as an alternative record source. And so, yeah, we need to know who those people were in order to try and research them. So, yeah, we have a team of independent researchers. And we do partner with universities, so if anybody is interested in doing some of this research, contact us.
First, I want to thank you for coming today, and thank you for the work that you do every day. You know, it must be very difficult. I'm wondering about, like, in many other countries across the world, there's been a lot of sort of judicial decisions that have created things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, things in Australia and New Zealand that have sort of forced those governments into sort of opening up. Do you see any kind of judicial avenues that might be out there for this work?
I forgot to answer that. I forgot to mention that. So to repeat the question, you know, it's referencing the judicial systems that have acknowledged and reconciled in other countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And do we see that happening here? No, because we were started by the Native American Rights Fund. They did look into legal action or, you know, some kind of congressional commission. We talked to members of Congress. I don't know exactly who they talked to. They didn't tell me it was anonymous, but basically those Congress people said, don't use the word commission. So we were like, okay, well, we want a truth and reconciliation process. We also petitioned Obama before he was leaving office to give us a truth report. And we just haven't been able to make any headway politically and judicially. The statute of limitations is an obstacle. And basically, historical assimilative boarding schools kind of waned out in the 70s when the American Indian Education Act became law in the 70s. A lot of these boarding schools were turned over to the Bureau of Indian Education, and tribes were given a lot more control. So now the boarding schools that are still open to this day, they encourage language and culture rather than prohibit it. So they're not the historical assimilative boarding schools that we're talking about. And really, you know, the statute of limitations federally being 40 years, we've run out of time.
So I think of this idea of reconciliation. So the semantics of it is interesting to me because you couldn't call it a commission, right? They would call it something else. So here the words have a lot of weight and power behind it. But I want to argue that reconciling is actually inaccurate because the term means that there actually once was good relations. So even this idea of conciliation prior to reconciliation, that's never been bridged. So when you mention folks coming into your organization and wanting to reconcile, how do you unpack the conciliatory aspects of it in the first place? How do you, especially if they're wanting to do this work immediately, right away? Because like I said, like, reconciling presumes that we were okay in the first place.
Right. Right. We've had conversations about that on our board and with our coalition members. That exact conversation about, you know, things were never actually conciliatory. Well, maybe you could view the treaties, but if you really study treaty history and treaty law, you know, there was a very small number of representatives signing multiple treaties, so they weren't actually, you know, true representatives of the tribes. Anyways, and in some cases there was a language barrier, so, and were those treaties, you know, was there conciliation in the beginning? And so how can we reconcile if they were never conciliatory? We have had that conversation, and for those who come in and want to jump straight to reconciliation, I do walk them through that process of, you know, truth and history, that we need to acknowledge what happened. We need you to acknowledge your role, and if they're from these church groups, you know, talk about it in terms of atonement. Like, you know, where's the repentance? How will you atone for this? You know, so it's a process. It puts a heavy burden on us to do that education, you know, for our non-native allies, and but there are some who really get it. We've partnered with the Better Way Foundation, and they actually fund the Indian Catholic School Network that has some Indian boarding schools that are still open and operating, and they're Catholic boarding schools. And they totally get it. They're the kind of allies that are like, absolutely, we want to help you do this, and we want to talk about our role, and we want to be truthful about that. So as not to repeat those mistakes of the past.
Well, before we finish, I wanted to first thank you again and give Marcus a chance to share a few words about educational foundations.
Thanks again. I just wanted to thank Virginia for putting so much of this together, and just remind everybody that this has been put on by Educational Foundations and Research. I hope you'll go out and spread the word that we bring interesting people, really knowledgeable people to campus to tell things. If you know of anybody who's wanting to do, say, historical research that can help out this project, we do have doctoral programs that are an excellent venue for doing. Thank you for coming today. Thank all of you for coming today, and all of you online as well.
And for those of you not online, there's food. Those of you online, sorry, limits to online education.